We're going to talk about XR and the human factor. I'm fortunate not only in my role at Boeing as a tech fellow. I've been at Boeing for, about 26 years now, I think, about 28 in the aerospace industry. I started when I was 6, so I'm a lot younger than I look, but at any rate, I'm also part of a group called the Area Augmented Reality for Enterprise Alliance, and Mark Sage is here, and I'm the co-chair for the safety committee. And so we've been doing a lot of work lately to try to figure out how to get some kind of guidelines and suggestions about how to keep our workers safe when they use VR, AR, XR, that type of stuff. And so that's what this presentation is going to be about. If I stop and ask you guys questions, that's the time for interaction. So please answer me. I mean it when I ask you questions. I want you guys to engage with me. Let's see if I can get this going. Okay, just a brief rundown. A lot of times there's a lot of confusion around this. The reality spectrum, this is actually based on Paul Milgram's seminal work, I believe it was in 94. Virtual and mixed reality are kind of on different ends of a continuum. Virtual reality is primarily marked by the fact that it is completely immersive, and mixed or augmented reality is actually augmenting the real world. So they have completely different objectives. In the virtual reality world, I want to replace your world with mine, and I very much want you to accept that and to believe that it's the real world and to engage with it in that way. When I'm augmenting the world, I don't want to replace the world. I want to actually add digital assets to the world so that you can interact with those as if they were physical objects in the real world. Once upon a time, Mom told us, don't sit too close to the TV. Now we stick it right on our face, right? What happened? So there's a lot of different sources of safety issues in augmented reality. The environment can pose hazards, the devices themselves can pose hazards, and then of course our cognition and our ability to sense the world can cause hazards to us. Some of the sources that we see in the environment, physical hazards, we can trip, slip, fall. There can be obstructions or elevation changes. Clear area of hazards. We need to try to, if we're going to use an augmented device, we need to make sure that we try to keep the areas uncluttered as we can. It does detract from your foveal or from your peripheral view. Sometimes you don't see things that you should. Provide spotting. So if you're going to be in an area that's a high hazard, for example, on Tanker we use the HoloLens to do wiring, to hang the wiring. Sometimes they'll have panels missing in the floor, and you don't want to fall through the floor of an airplane. It's a really bad scene if that happens. So we use actually spotters when we're using the headsets on the planes. High fidelity practice training sessions. So actually use the device in the way that you intend to use it in the factory is really important. One of the things that we've implemented is auto sleep mode. So if they're actually start moving, the headset through the accelerometer senses that, and it'll turn off the screen so that it's not occluding your vision while you're walking around. And geofencing so that we can inform the user of hazardous areas. So a lot of times these guys are busy, they're trying to collect their information, they're trying to collect their tools, whatever it is that they need, and they're focused on thinking in the mind what they're going to do next on the job. It's really easy for them to walk out into an aisleway or something not thinking about it. So one of the things that we can do with the headsets is to actually warn them as they approach a hazardous area. Energy hazards can be a problem. When we have the plane, when we're doing testing on the wiring, we have to bring the power up on the plane, and we have a thing called LOTO. Stands for lockout, tag out. And so anytime somebody enters that area, they're supposed to, if they're going to turn on the power, they're supposed to lock that out, and they actually have a little padlock that shows that system is being worked on. As humans, we're fallible, and so sometimes they forget to do that. With the energy hazards, we can actually warn people when they walk into an area. Safety training around hazardous issues, so hazmat, LOTO, things like that, and breach alarms. So motion sense, if I notice that there's a disturbance in a particular area, if I notice that you're in a geofenced area that you shouldn't be in, you don't have access, you don't have authorization or access rights to that, then to call the appropriate folks to address that. We can also, mobile hazards can be from forklifts, from machinery, people, cranes. We have to mark these areas, and again, if we can geofence those, we can make sure that we could give some kind of a warning, a flasher, a buzzer, something to get your attention when you're distracted so that you can observe the hazard that's at hand. With these devices, sometimes they can occlude your vision. Normal vision is impaired versus they tend to perform worse. And a lot of times we lack skills or strategy. We don't really teach people. We kind of give them these devices and we don't really plan for how they might have these problems. So again, going and practicing in these environments with these kind of devices to address those kind of problems, make sure that people know the system, that the training is appropriately designed for what's going to be done. We don't try to do this kind of round file type approach, that we actually design the training to address a particular task. Has anybody ever used the early Google Glass? Did you notice any heat issues? Hands? Anybody? Yeah, so some of the devices early on, I think they've addressed this through reprogramming and that type of stuff, and the devices have gotten a whole lot better. But early on, a lot of the glass-type devices would get pretty warm. The processors would heat up, and they could be uncomfortable. Insulate the headwear to isolate the heat, and also reduce the use of the equipment, so swap it out. Be able to hot swap those things. Limited battery life can be an issue. Reduce the workflow requirements. Sometimes, the errors that happen a lot of times happen at times where you have some kind of a lapse. So if you looked at safety data, you're going to see a lot of the incidents and accidents are going to cluster around break shift, times. So when people take a break, when they go to lunch, and at open and close of shift. And it's predominantly because people are not focused on what it is they're doing. There's a big break in psychological flow. Form factor, sometimes the headsets will be too heavy. Sometimes they'll cause neck strain. Some of these things can be upwards of 3 pounds. Modifications to the needed gear, sometimes you can actually mitigate that. At Boeing out in the factory, we have these hats that we have to wear called bump caps. So when the guys and gals are going on off the planes, they don't hit their head on something sharp. Well, those bump caps, because the webbing in them also helps to spread out and dissipate the weight of that device. So it's actually served a double duty for us in addition to protecting the mechanic. It also helps to mitigate the potential weight issues that they would have and make it more comfortable. Rework the UI and control channels. A lot of times, sometimes these things will use physical touch. And when you have sealer on your hands or things like that, it can be a problem. Things can get slippery. You can, gunk up your device, things like that. All this stuff takes away from your attention on the focus on the job that you're trying to accomplish. So voice commands can be helpful with that. And then in the future, we're going to have lightweight contact lens devices and non-invasive sensors. I've actually done some pretty amazing work. Forgive me for not being able to cite this correctly. I think it was University of UCLA, if I'm not mistaken. But they were able to actually put sensors on the outside of a person's head and intercept the visual signals going from their eyes to the visual cortex. And they showed the guy a picture of a parrot flying. And then they ran this through an algorithm, and they showed what the computer thought he was looking at. And it's pretty eerie how close it is. So it won't be long off in the future when we won't have to worry about these devices. They'll kind of disappear into the background and things will simply get done. So some of the safety issues in the AR device, the effects, again, the physical load, and there's some data there on the different devices. Daiquiri Smart Helmet, heavy, it's about 3 pounds. It can be, quite a bit if you wear it for very long. Make interval and time breaks. Stretching exercises are ways to help mitigate some of those problems. Eye strain, sometimes we'll have issues with brightness, focus, focal depth, frame rate, resolution. We can adjust those based on doing some simple eye tests to find out kind of what you need. Also make sure that the shade on the headset is proper for the environment. So if you're trying to use a HoloLens outside where it's really bright, like we do out on the tarmac, on the flight line, it's not going to work very well. You're going to have lots of problems. So you want to make sure that you account for that with the task and the equipment that you give these folks. And one of the things that I found very interesting, we were out in the factory doing the stuff on the tanker, the mechanics would actually get the headset and they would turn the brightness up so they could actually be very vivid in terms of looking at the wiring. And then when they'd actually go to use the device, they would turn it down almost as far as it could go. So they wanted a just noticeable difference, a ghost, if you will, of that wiring limb as they went to hang the wiring. And the reason for that is because they don't want to occlude their hands as they go and physically do the manual labor. So I thought that was really interesting. But there's things we can do in terms of the brightness to address some of these issues. Assure proper model alignment and position and persistence of that relationship to the real world. Sometimes if anybody's used these devices, does anybody ever see any kind of drift issues? Hands? Okay. So sometimes you'll find drift issues. We found some ways to help mitigate that. One of them is we do kind of oversampling with the cloud. So we will do multi-scans of that environment ahead of time. Second thing that we do is we have some patents on some of these things. We can actually go and define in the model specific points that we will then go and physically touch with what we call a hammer, kind of as a nickname. It's a tool that has that clicker on it. So you go and you're saying this piece in the model right here, and you identify it in the model and you touch it in the physical world. And so it aligns those two. It makes it a lot more accurate. With the interface on the devices, a lot of times poor UI or poor user experience design. It'll be in a noisy environment, it'll be unclear, too much or not enough detail. Sometimes there's incongruencies with what you're supposed to be doing and what the headset is displaying. We want to minimize the UI elements. Less is more in this case. If you really love your end users, try to automate a lot of the things that they're going to have to do manually. Don't make them do anything extraneous that they don't have to. It always makes me crazy. Here's an example at Boeing. We have about 150,000 employees around the world. A lot of babies are born to Boeing employees, by the way. And so when you have a baby, you have to go into this amazing myriad of different sites to update all of your information because a lot of things change about you. Your taxes, your vacation, all these different kind of things, your insurance. You have to go and change these. And what does it ask you every time? Who are you? What is your shop that you're from? I mean, all this basic information. Quit asking people that kind of stuff. For goodness sakes, I've been with Boeing for 26 years. You know better than my mother who I am, right? Quit asking me that stuff. Go pull that stuff from a database somewhere. Ask me the pertinent stuff that you can't know ahead of time. What's the baby's birth weight? Where was the baby born? Things like that. That makes a lot of sense. In the same way, we need to design our UIs so that we minimize the kind of interactions that we have to have. If you love your users, we think that users want more. They want more power, more ubiquity, more features and functions. What users really want is less hassle, less frustration. Their focus is on getting something done. As much as it pains me to say this, I'm an ex-coder. I used to write software. As much as I'd like to think that they want to use my amazing code that I wrote, it's an absolute lie. They will tolerate it because it helps them to get something done in a better, faster, or cheaper way. So don't abuse them in that way. Just-in-time items, make sure that you provide these bits of information only when they're needed. Look at the context of what they're doing and provide those elements of information then. A lot of times what we do when we go to put these things on these headsets is we just kind of, e-enable the paper. We just scan all these things and we just dump a bunch of documents and stuff on some kind of a device. Now they have to virtually rifle through all this information instead of providing them with what they need just when they need it. Group items according to space, color, shape, order of importance, and the amount of time used. Try to make sure that the information is procedural and kit the information, if you will. Think about following a recipe to bake some chocolate chip cookies. ABC, 1, 2, 3. Make it very step-by-step, very formulaic. Image manipulation provides zoom in and zoom out capabilities. Allow them to manipulate the image to interrogate the digital assets further. You heard Peggy earlier was talking about that was some of the capabilities that her mechanics required in order to be effective using the Google Glass out on the tractors. So these are kind of some fun things. We're talking predominantly about augmented reality here, so some things you may or may not be aware of. The human eye weighs about an ounce, can distinguish over 500 shades of gray, can distinguish up to 1 million color surfaces in higher acuity than the strongest telescope. It's pretty amazing what we're capable of. The outermost layer of the eye is the only living tissue in the human body that doesn't contain blood vessels. Receive nutrients from the tears and aqueous humor. People generally read 25% slower from a computer screen as compared to paper. This is important when you design. Make sure that you have these considerations when you think about the interface that you're creating. Men tend to be able to read fine print better than women, but it doesn't matter because we don't follow instructions anyway. So. All babies are colorblind when they're born, and your eye blinks over 10,000 times a year, about 25 times a minute. So I thought that was kind of interesting, a little bit of fun facts there. So perceptual and situational awareness. Visual distraction, research shows that attention to human figures, our attention is drawn to human figures. So the way that we'd use that in a design is making sure that if we're doing VR, AR type design and we want to use human figures in the display or the programming, that we do this sparingly because it tends to pull our attention. Peripheral vision, it used to be that we tried to preserve the foveal vision. We would put a lot of things around the outside. The problem that we have with that is when you're talking about speed and motion, that's what we predominantly use our peripheral vision for. So if we have a bunch of stuff in the outer frame, it's going to give you a tunnel vision type effect, and it makes it really hard for us to assess speed and direction, and that can be a problem if you're moving around while you're wearing the device. Color perception. There's a pretty good percentage of men that are colorblind more than women. So we want to make sure that we're not using colors to differentiate very dangerous conditions and those type of things. Or if you use colors, also use things like shapes and patterns to further distinguish those from the normal condition. Dark adaptation. There's a thing called discomfort glare, and that's when, a good example is when you wake up first thing in the morning and the brightness of the clock, it causes you to kind of wince, right? So we want to make sure that we're aware of that because it causes undue stress on the user. Color red to amber is better than blue to green in terms of dark adaptation. If you ever look at military gauges, you might notice that almost all the time they're red. They're red or they're kind of orange colored. And the reason why is because we have a lower sensitivity to that when you're going from a dark environment and you look at the gauge and then you look back at the dark environment. If you go to the lighter colors, the greens, the blues, certainly not white, what happens is you incur a longer time penalty for your eyes to dark adapt and to adjust back to what you're doing. Critical out in the war theater that we are able to do quick dark adaptations. Red is the least discomfort glare, most legible in low light. Low phototopic luminance for reading is about around 20. That's for comfort. And for high phototopic for maps and stuff, you need to have about 40, setting of about 40. Black letters on a white background is most legible. A lot of people don't know that they'll put white letters on a black background and you can't read it as well. Visual vibrations. Has anybody ever seen blue text on a red background? Any hands? Did you enjoy that? Probably not, right? Yeah, it'll almost instantaneously give you a headache. There's color charts out there that will tell you about these vibration type color combinations. Stay away from those. They're horrifically bad in terms of causing fatigue and stress. They're really, really bad on you. Poor vision. As we get older, we have eye diseases, presbyopia, macular degeneration, reduced visual capabilities. A lot of our workforce, especially at Boeing, we have aging mechanics and stuff, so we need to make the text a little bit larger. We need to make sure that we're kind of going the extra mile relative to making things easier to read. By the way, of interest might be that some of these headsets actually will help people with things like cataracts to actually see a little bit better. So it's kind of interesting. There's some studies around that as well. Movement occluded causes misjudgment of speed, as we talked about earlier, and then hand-eye coordination. There's been some studies with Terabes that the welding helmets can cause problems for that reason, because it's occluding vision. It gives you kind of this tunnel vision type effect, and folks can have accidents because they're not aware of this detriment that they have. With sensory memory decay, you have what's called an iconic memory, and that visual memory lasts about 200 to 500 milliseconds. It's very, very fleeting. If you guys have ever look at something and look away really quickly, you'll see kind of an after shadow. Okay, when you do that, that's your iconic memory. So it's kind of funny, can hold up to about 5 characters. We actually use this pretty regularly and we don't even realize it. Does anybody remember a thing that we used to have called a phone book? Just kind of full of paper, and it was really thick and it had a bunch of phone numbers. So once upon a time, when we used phone books, we would go and we'd look up a phone number, and usually the phone was located on the wall somewhere remote from the phone book if you were like me. So what would you do after you read the phone number? What would you do? Anybody? Repeat it to yourself. That's exactly right. Do you know why you do that? Auditory. Exact. Man, you're good. I need to start taking you with me. I got a good straight person here. So what's happening is because you know that your iconic memory is very fleeting, what you're doing is you're turning it into a phonetic loop to get it into your echoic memory, which lasts about 3 to 4 seconds. So you start looping this, you start repeating it. And what happens when your kid walks up and says, "Hey, Dad, hey, Mom?" It's gone, right? It evaporated. Now I got to go back and read it again because it just exceeded the length of your echoic memory. The reason why I bring this up is because think about that poor mechanic who's out there in the factory, and this is real. Let me put this in perspective. These mechanics are out here trying to wire this tanker. They go and they pull their drawings. I'm not kidding you, it's at least 20-foot long scroll of drawings. If it was one contiguous drawing, we're taking a 3-dimensional wiring loom and we're putting it on 2-dimensional paper. Very lossy, very bad, right? So, but no, it's not, it's not one contiguous drawing. It's a bunch of chopped up little sectional views of all these different angles of that drawing. So what they have to do next is they take their highlighter and they go to each one of those ones that pertains to what they're doing. And they have to mark each of these little views with that highlighter. Now that they know which ones pertain to what they're doing, they have to go back and read all this. And in their head, they have to mentally assemble, what does this wiring look like hanging above their heads? There's no place to scroll this thing out on the plane. So they chop it up in 8.5 by 11 sheets and they walk up there with the phone book again, right, on the plane. And they look around and they flip really quickly between these pages. And they try to imagine, where does this thing go? As you can imagine, it's really a bad scene. We had less than 50% first pass yield on that because it's such a horrifically bad process. By being able to actually go on the plane and be able to recognize that, they put HoloLens on, they can look up and actually see the loom floating where it should be in the plane, and then just connect the dots. We went to 100% first pass yield in our proof of concept. Pretty amazing. I never expected it to be quite that high, but if you think about the gymnastics these folks were doing, it was ridiculous. We were able to cut our overall takt time by over 52% just from that implementation alone. That's with the proof of concept. That's not productionized in any way. That's a really good question. Again, I want to stress proof of concept, right? We're just trying this stuff out. We're learning how to do this, get our feet underneath us. The interesting thing about that is, more important than cutting the takt time overall by over 52% is the fact that when you go from a 50% or less first pass yield to 100%, most people think that in a production environment, if you mess up on an airplane part, that you have to redo it, so it costs you twice. You did it, now you redo it. Not the case. You did it, you now have to undo it, now you have to redo it. Then you have scheduling impacts, you have material impacts, you have labor impacts. So anytime you make a mistake, it's easily about a 4 to 5x multiplier in terms of the cost of that mistake. So I would suggest, I haven't done the math on this yet, but you very easily should get a strong ROI out of something like that if you can eliminate mistakes. Yeah?
We also find in our industry that 60 to 70% increase happens during the rework.
Yep. And why is that? Because you're distracted, right? You got too many things going on. Now you're stressed out, you're distracted, you're probably increasingly time pressured. So you have all these things that are impinging on our ability to attend in a meaningful way. That's what eats our lunch. By the way, I want to throw a kudo out here to Brian. These guys at Upskill are doing some amazing stuff. You might have read in the news too, in addition to like the stuff we're doing at Tanker Wiring, they're doing some really great things with helping us with building up wiring looms, right? And so you're like, well, wait a minute, you have kind of like Google Glass or Vuzix and that type of stuff, and then you have HoloLens. Well, so why 2 devices? Well, because they're entirely different operations. A lot of people don't understand that. When you're doing more of the bench work type stuff, the things that Brian and his company are doing with us with Upskill are incredibly worthwhile to us. They cost less. The headsets are cheaper, in terms of actually buying the device. Development's easier for those. I mean, there's a whole myriad of reasons why that's exactly the right tool for that type of work. When you're trying to hang wiring on an airplane inside a tanker, it's not going to work, right? So make sure that you really think about what are the requirements of the task that you're trying to do. But I wanted to throw a kudo to Brian because they're doing a great job. And he's also, that's my partner in crime. We're trying to slog through the security issues and figure out how to secure these devices. And it is not an easy task. So again, thank you for sticking in there with us because I know it hasn't been fun. But it's critical that we do this stuff. With cognitive loading, there's a couple of different things. There's no standard kind of way to do this, but there's an index of cognitive activity by Marshall in 2002, and they look at changes in pupil dilation during interaction with displays as a indicator of workload. And then there's a NASA workload scale that can measure stress dimensions, but there's no AR specific industry-wide measures, and so we need to address that. It's something that we're looking at. Cognitive memory issues, interruptions in task switching. Typical of knowledge workers, there's no significant difference. Psychological flow, when you're in the zone. The interesting thing about that is if the disruption actually adds more beneficial information that is context sensitive to what you're doing, those disruptions are actually beneficial. They find that people improve their performance. Sometimes there's also an improvement when somebody's working on a tough problem. They're trying to figure out some kind of algorithm, for example, and things aren't gelling, and they just park that, and they leave it, and they come back. And it's called cognitive marinating, sometimes is what they refer to that as. But it allows you to come back and rethink it from a different perspective. A lot of times the solution becomes clear. It takes approximately 23 minutes on average for that disruption. We're doing some deeply analytical or thought-provoking task. It takes us on average 23 minutes to get back to the point that we left off when we had the disruption. So you're working away at your desk, and you get that phone call, that shoulder tap, whatever, 23 minutes. And the good news is we can usually do that 82% of the time if it occurs within the same day. The bad news is we get interrupted every 10.5 minutes in the office. It's amazing we can get anything done at all, right? So the reason why I'm sharing this is the value of being able to have that point of use and time and need information. I don't have all these disruptions that I continually suffer otherwise. More stress and frustration, mental effort, workload, and time pressure results. Cognitive control, there's two stages. There's a help us switch that they figured out, and that's the goal shifting. I want to do this now instead of that. And then the second phase is actually rule activation. I'm turning off the rules for this circumstance, and I'm turning on rules for that. It often happens within a few tenths of a second, but it adds up quickly. Mental blocks can add up to 40% cost of productive time. So the largest reason why I'm belaboring all this stuff is the biggest, most significant thing that we can preserve and benefit that we can get out of augmented reality is the ability to protect that cognitive flow. It's really important. Some of the benefits, we've heard about all these negative things about what it can cause that way. Decreased travel, we have less searching, less gathering data, mechanics in the factory. Increased focus, we have more time on task, less switching, preserved psychological flow. Better access to more complete information, so I can get a deeper level of information. I can watch a video. I can custom tailor that to whatever my personal requirements are. It provides me with novel understanding because I can interact with that data in different ways. Back to that mechanic, you know why we have all those sectional views that are in that printout that they do? Because every one of those represents a mechanic trying to do some job, and they said, gosh, I don't have enough information, so they send off a request to inspection. They say, hey, I need a view from this angle. So they produce the view and they send it back. All that incurs time. So those are all circumstances where they had to get a different view. When you have augmented reality, you can have infinite views instantaneously, right? It's amazing how valuable that is. Enhanced collaboration, you can use the remote assist capability to get an answer right now instead of setting up a meeting to have a plan to create a committee to, 2 weeks later you're solving a 2-week-old problem. That's ridiculous. Business cannot operate at that speed. In situational awareness, we can use sensors and IoT to alert to emerging threats, keep people out of harm's way. Wing inspection is a good example for that. So this is that infographic that I talked about. And I think Mark has some, I'm gonna hang him out there. I think he has some copies of this that he could hand out to you. If not, we'll see what we can do about getting those if you guys are interested. But the idea behind this infographic is in the center there you see cognition, sensory, and physical. This is roughly the presentation we just talked about and the data that we talked about through that. Outside of that, we have kind of the AR experience, environmental, and then device accessories. So these are the hazards that are incurred by those different things. And then outside of that is the benefits. So that was what? Okay. So there's Mark.
Hi, yeah, I'm Mark Sage. What I'll do, and I'll work with Brian, I'll make sure everyone gets an email copy of the infographic as well, but it'll be available on the area website soon. which is www.thearea.org. Please feel free to share or pass any feedback to myself and Brian, because we're looking to improve this all the time. Okay?
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah, so the idea behind this was to give you kind of a shorthand infographic way to look at this and think, to consider the different myriad of risks that you could occur potentially in using AR devices. And then we're actually working on a tool. Amina's doing some amazing work in the area. I'm a co-chair for the safety committee. And again, Augmented Reality for Enterprise Alliance is the area acronym. Amina's doing some amazing work where we're actually creating this tool that will enable you to come in at some point. It's in prototype form right now, but you can come in and you can basically kind of, through answering this series of questions, kind of like TurboTax, you can disposition what you're trying to do, and then it'll kick out a custom report for the kind of things you ought to pay close attention to and mitigating factors. So I think it's going to be really helpful. Does that sound like that could be useful to any of you guys? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you. That's all I had today. I'm sorry it's a little drier than usual, but lots of data. Thank you very much.